Hello, and welcome to the Unhinged Binge, where I am currently sinking into the sandpit of reality. Today, I'd like to do a deep dive and analysis in the slasher film. We will look at what a slasher is, how they came to be by analyzing proto-slashers, the real-life impact in the rise of serial killers, and other variables, such as how censorship imposed on films limited sex and violence, and the subsequent shift in censorship standards coincided with the sexual revolution, second wave feminism, as well as better practical effects. Further, I'd like to look at some various tropes of the slasher film and why they exist and persist. I should mention, I have done videos on trans representation in film, and that does focus on the slasher film, as well as on the final girl and on the sex equals death tropes. So I'd recommend checking those out, as I won't be going into a lot of detail about those ones, but I will be mentioning them so many times it's ridiculous. I'll just throw out my conclusions I made in those videos, so you don't need to watch them, but if you want to have like a further understanding of why I came to those conclusions, that's where all that is. And I will say I do have a script. So if you're watching this in the video format and it looks like I'm reading off a script, it's because I am. It's 43 pages long. I'm a wordy witch. It's fine. I was inspired to do this from doing a podcast with my buddy Brendan Marr. His podcast is usually about Star Wars, but he does Halloween ones. His podcast is Page Turners They Were Not. So I'd recommend that. And I was also heavily inspired in terms of the films I was looking at by a book by J.A. Kerswell from 2018 called the Teenage Slasher Movie Book, Second Edition. And I have a list on Letterboxd that is all of the movies he mentioned, as well as some movies that I threw in myself. So if you'd like to take a look at that, I'll have it linked below. I will, of course, have all of my sources linked below, and anything that I am quoting directly, obviously, I will mention. All right, my last two things is I will give you notice if I'm going to spoil a movie. However, off the top, I will tell you I will be going on and on and on about Psycho Halloween, Friday the 13th, The Hitcher, Urban Legend, a few others, but those ones definitely I'll be going deep into. And anything else, like I said, I will say beforehand, so you know to skip a little bit ahead if you don't want a spoiler for that particular movie. And lastly, if you're going to get PO'd that I call out men for harming women and go into how misogyny plays into the slasher film, well, then this is simply not the video for you. Thank you for stopping by. See ya, honey. Also, have you ever watched a slasher movie? Okay, so we got some oozing to do. I started off with a timeline. It's a 3-page timeline. I got really into the timeline, and I don't want to read the whole thing, because if I did, my script goes from 43 pages to 46 pages. So basically, I'm going to speed run it. All right. Since the beginning of time, misogyny. In 1878, we have the horse in motion, which is that clip of a man riding a horse. That's very important, because this is when we really start to see the dawn of the moving picture, literally moving picture. 1888, the Whitechapel murders occur. If you don't know who that is Jack the Ripper. We have a rise in yellow journalism because of William Randolph Hearst and also Pulitzer. I don't think he gets enough credit in the 1890s. In 1896, we have the first narrative film, and we have more narrative films beginning. So instead of just shorts of, hey, let's put a camera on this thing and show that we can show things in motion, let's actually tell a story. 1906, we have what is considered the first full-length movie. It's about an hour long. And at that point, we start getting longer films. I'm going to really skip past, because I go further into detail later about censorship. But starting in 1907, we're getting a lot of, we're getting our first censorship boards in the US. And there's going to be a lot of different ones, and I'll explain further later what that means. By 1911, we have our first feature-length horror movie, which is The Inferno from Italy. The World War I happens, and that's very important because of World War I. We have World War II, and in between those times, we have the Great Depression, which causes a moral backlash, which creates more censorship. And we have the creation of the MPPDA, which today is the MPA, which is the Motion Production Associate. Yeah, I think it's the Motion Producer Association, not production. And back then, they were the ones who were creating the self-censorship standards, which at the time were the Hays Code, and that lasted from 1934 to 1968. Wherein then we get the creation of what we have today, which is the rating system. In the 1950s, we have the rise in teen movies, because before then we didn't really have teenagers, because marketers didn't realize that they could sell things to teenagers. So you'll see a lot of this is like, hey, this is a target demographic we haven't tapped yet, so let's start making movies about them. That's pretty common. The 1960s, we have second wave feminism, sexual revolution, obviously very important. I should walk back up. In 1915, there was a very important Supreme Court case, which stated, I wasn't going to talk about censorship. Oh, well, I guess I am, because I already started. There was a Supreme Court case that decided that films did not have First Amendment protection. That was not overturned until 1952, which goes back into the whole censorship thing. In 1957, very important, Ed Gein is caught, and he's going to be the inspiration for a lot of horror films, such as Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs, and so on. As I said, 60s, we have second wave feminism, sexual revolution. Psycho came out in 1960. 1960s, we also have Civil Rights Act and a lot of social changes going on. And in 1969, the Tate and LaBianca murders were committed by the Manson family. Pretty important. In the 70s, there is a rise in exploitation films because of the lowered censorship standards, and also as kind of a counter-revolution for what was happening in the 60s, which is especially going to take off in the 80s with Reagan being president. We also have like a rise in serial killers and child abductions, which is very unfortunate. In 1971, Nixon apparently declared that, quote, drug abuse to be public enemy number one, quoting from Britannica, which is insane. We're starting to get more like brash kind of exploitation movies. I mentioned that before, but like Wes Craven made Last House on the Left. William Friedkin adapted Peter Blattley's The Exorcist. I'm just going to throw out 1973, Roe v. Wade legalized abortion. That's going to get overturned, but they didn't know that back then. Woohoo, back then. The U.S. left Vietnam in 73 as well. 1974, we have the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In 75, Spielberg released Jaws, which is like considered the first blockbuster, and that's really going to change the landscape of film. In 76, Brian De Palma adapted Stephen King's Carrie, very important. The 80s, we have Ronald Reagan, the war on drugs. Ronald Reagan's administration defunded mental health. There's a rise in prison population because of that. Also a rise in nationalism and consumerism, child abduction rates. And we have the Stranger Danger campaign, which is very important to what we would talk about later. 1978, we have John Carpenter and Deborah Hill's Halloween, which is very important. 1979, we have Scott Ridley's Alien. In 1980, Ted Turner launched CNN, which is the first 24-hour news channel. Very important. News is very important to the slasher film, which might seem weird or might seem obvious. I don't know, but I'm going to talk about it. In 1980, Victor Miller and Sean S. Cunningham made Friday the 13th. 1981, Rick Baker won the first Academy Award for Best Makeup for American Werewolf in London. 1984, Wes Craven released Nightmare on Elm Street, and we have an additional rating to our rating system of PG-13. Before that, it went from PG to R. In 1985, there's music censorship boards, and we get all those hearings that end up getting the parental advisory stickers on music. In the 80s, we also have VHS and home video increasingly becoming more prevalent. And I'm quoting A History of Film and Odyssey by Mark Cousins. By the end of the 1980s, the target audience for much of Western commercial cinema was teenage, male, and hooked on MTV. And then the last thing I want to point out in the timeline is 1995, Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson released the film Scream, which is a genre deconstruction of the slasher, and it added a 90s element of meta-ness, which really revitalized the slasher. The slasher boom is considered from 78 to 84. Okay, that concludes the timeline. I was really talking fast because I wanted to get through it. Okay. So a natural place to start is with the beginning. I'm so smart sometimes. I really just I get it. I got my finger on the pulse of sense making. I'm so dumb. Okay, so I decided to define the slasher. This is my personal definition from having watched a lot of slasher films. Um, you might have a different definition. You could look it up in a dictionary, find a different definition. This is just my personal definition. A lot of the stuff I just wasn't pulling quotes. I'm like, this was just my own opinions on these things. So definition of the slasher directly from Hi, I'm Lego. This is from me. The slasher is a subgenre of horror film depicting typically a masked, though not always, killer wielding a bladed or pointed weapon, basically anything other than a firearm, although some slashers do use firearms, very rarely though, and stalking a group of high school to college-aged youths to kill them. Slasher. This movie was slashing, if nothing else. So then I decided to create a standard formula for the slasher film. So this comes again from my horror knowledge and terms I picked up over the years. You'll definitely hear a lot of these in like the Search of Darkness trilogy and Kerswell's book, again, the teenage movie slasher book, second revised expanded edition. Okay. We have an opening kill to set the stage and let audiences know what they're in for and gives the filmmakers time for the rest of the first act to relax and kind of set the stage for the rest of the kills by introducing the location and the characters. We have an original sin. This is our backstory. It gives the killer their motive. It might have a special date or an anniversary, like a holiday, like Halloween, Friday the 13th. Sometimes the original sin is the opening kill, though not always. We have our harbinger of doom. This is a specific character, and typically unhinged old man who gives a warning and might also give exposition. We have our cast, aka the red shirts, if you will. And this is a finite amount of high school to college aged youths who want to party or camping, going on vacation, babysitting, having a sleepover, something. And they're unsupervised, high, drunk, and horny. Except the final girl. But also with the cast, I should add in the sin factor, as Randy Meeks from Scream would call it. Sex, drugs, alcohol, showering, babysitting, walking in the woods, skinny dipping, swimming, being at home, going camping, pulling pranks, asking who's there, being alive when someone wants you not to be. So rude. Then we have our final girl. She's the main character, the protagonist, the survivor of the film. We have our mad and or masked killer, the antagonist, often silent. Location is very important in a horror film in general, but specifically to the slasher, very important indeed. Horror films rely on isolation, physical and geographical isolation achieved often by a specific location, such as Alien. That was very loud. I'm so sorry. Such as Alien being in space or The Thing being in, where are they in The Thing? Antarctica? Somewhere isolated. Somewhere where they can't easily get help. Or from traveling or camping, new environment or people who maybe you don't know or trust or how to get access to. A lack of support from authority, so like social isolation, not being believed by adults. This is typically found in adult versus teen films, which are very common in the 50s, like in The Blob. I'm going to throw in, like, if you're doing horror bingo, this should be your free space for an 80s horror movie. The car not starting. It's such a cliche, but it's completely necessary for the film to work, because if you can just drive away, then you're not going to have a movie, right? Next, you have the timeline. Usually slashers take place over about 2 days. You might have like your initial setup and character introduction, and then once night falls, you might have a normal night and then a night of just killing, or you might go straight into the night of just killing. But your killer usually only has about 24 hours to pick off their victims, because after that, normally in a slasher film, when dawn breaks, it brings help. And that really helps with the tight time frame, helps in the isolation. And then we have characters splitting up to get killed. It's very Agatha Christie, and then they were none. It goes back to isolation. You know, if you stray away from the group and the community, then you're more susceptible to harm and danger. I guess mass murder doesn't make a good horror film or something. We have the final girl versus the killer, which is our third act long chase battle scene. And then we have an ending chair jumper. That's what Tom Savini called it. And it's one last scare to leave the film kind of open-ended and unintentionally open for a sequel. And it's just like that one last scare. I kind of started with Carrie. I mean, it didn't literally start with Carrie, but a lot of directors and writers will reference that they were pulling from Carrie when they did it. And the chair jumper in that one is when I don't remember the girl's name, but the girl who's being nice to Carrie, spoilers for Carrie, goes to visit Carrie's grave, and Carrie's hand comes out from the grave and grabs her arm. And then the one last thing is the killer doesn't die, or if they do, they come back in the sequels anyway. And that is the formula. I made a little graph right here. I can kind of go through it really quickly, and I'm going to be comparing Halloween with Friday the 13th. So obviously spoilers for those. We have our opening kill and our original sin all in one with Halloween. 6-year-old Michael Myers kills his 15-year-old sister, Judith Meyer. That is our opening kill and our original sin. Comparatively, Friday the 13th, the original sin is Jason drowning, and the opening kill is Pamela killing 2 camp counselors. So we don't know it's Pamela at the time. A harbinger of doom in Halloween. I mean, I'm pretty sure it's Dr. Loomis. And then Friday the 13th, it's the harbinger of doom himself, Crazy Ralph. Our cast for Halloween: Lori, Annie, Linda, Bob, Danny, Lindsay, Tommy, not Danny. Don't know why I said Danny. Friday the 13th, there's a lot of forgettable youths and Kevin Bacon. Final girl, Laurie Strode, of course, for Halloween, and Alice Hardy for Friday the 13th. Our slasher for Halloween is Michael Myers. For Friday the 13th, it's Pamela Voorhees. Isolation for Halloween, it is the tight time frame that doesn't allow the kids able to get help, although help is continuously trying to get to them with Dr. Loomis and Sheriff Brackett. And Friday the 13th, it's the isolation of the woods. For our time frame for Halloween, we have Halloween night, and for Friday the 13th, we have Friday the 13th, the entire day. And then splitting up, oh yeah, they're naturally split up because the teens it's Halloween, they're kind of off doing their own thing, and they're trying to gather together, but certain stances arise, they're not able to do so before Michael kills them. And then in Friday the 13th, it's just the Agatha Christie thing. It's finding a reason to get the kids to split up so that Pamela can pick them off one by one. The sin factor for both of them is sex, drugs, drinking. Same. It's kind of the same for every movie. Our third act, chase scene with a female in distress for both of them. Their last chair jumper, I shot him, Sheriff. I shot him 6 times. And Michael Myers is yet not there. And we get this ending with a bunch of still frames around the town to show that Michael could be anywhere. For Friday the 13th, our chair jumper is Jason popping out of the lake. And in Halloween, Michael Myers clearly does not die. In Friday the 13th, Pamela Voorhees clearly did die. Okay. I will now be moving on to origins. Sort of. I wrote out what I call the cycle. So we begin slashers with the proto-slasher. I'm going to talk about those much later on. And it's until 1960 where we get the grandfather of the slasher, Psycho. With that same year, though, Peeping Tom came out, and I think the year before or the year after Blood Feast came out. And I would say that those are kind of our really initial, these were our first, slashers. That if you're watching it, you might think it looks old, but you would identify it as a slasher. And then through the 60s, as the 61 to 78, I would still say these are proto-slashers. And we have stuff like Last House on the Left, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Black Christmas, a lot of giallo films in Italy. But it's not until 1978 where we get the father of the slasher, Halloween. And then in 1980, we get Friday the 13th, which cements the tropes that Halloween sets up. So from 78 to 84, we have the slasher boom. And then we have the slasher being reinvented and kind of revitalized in 84 with Nightmare on Elm Street. And that's where we start getting a lot more slashers that have like hat on a hat, like he's a slasher and a dream demon. You know what I mean? And then we get our meta slashers in 95. And then our 21st century slashers are, again, it's a hat on a hat. And they're a lot more meta and kind of cheeky, like Happy Death Day and Freaky, which are Christopher Landon films, but also like It's a Wonderful Knife, Slaughterhouse, Spinal Girls, Totally Killer. But we also are getting like throwbacks to more gritty ones. Like I think Terrifier 2 is going to start a new wave, but it's a little bit too close to tell how it's going to affect the landscape of horror as I say this in 2024. All right. So again, I'm going to come back. I'm going to circle back around. I promise, to Proto-Slashers. I'm actually going to start with Granddaddy Slasher. Hitchcock made Psycho in 1960, based on a book that was inspired by real-life sensationalized articles about Ed Gein. They were not inspired by Ed Gein. They were inspired by the articles, the sensationalized, I cannot emphasize that word enough, sensationalized articles about Ed Gein. Psycho tells the story of a woman, Marion Crane. Oh, I guess spoilers for Psycho. So Psycho tells the story of a woman, Marion Crane, on the run, who stops at the Bates Motel, where she meets meek and timid hotel manager Norman Bates. Marion winds up dead in one of the most iconic murder scenes in cinema. It even has its own documentary devoted just to it. Marion's sister Lila and Marion's boyfriend Sam Loomis investigate Marion's disappearance. The audience is led to believe that the killer is Norman's mother, but we learn that Norman's mother is dead. Shock. The twist ending reveals the truth in all its lurid detail a swinging nude light bulb can provide to a fruit seller. The rotting corpse of Mrs. Bates, a shocked Lila, a screaming Norman in a dress wielding a knife as Sam holds him back. Then we have I didn't time it, but it's like a 10-minute expo dump by an almost gleeful psychiatrist, I think his name is Dr. Richmond, explaining that no, Norman isn't trans or the killer, not exactly. Norman has what's now known as dissociative identity disorder. Oh, and he killed his mother. And it's the mother half of Norman's mind. I wrote a whole essay on this. It's just problematic, so I'll just skip to that. But keep in mind that it is the grandfather of the slasher. This film is part of the genetic outline that went into the creation of the slasher film, and it's unfortunate that it is so problematic. Psycho came out while the Hays Code was losing control, but was still in use. I'll talk a bit more in detail about the Hays Code later. Psycho is a low-budget black and white movie made in an era of color films with harsh limitations regarding what it could and could not show. For reference, see Flushing Toilet. Despite that, Psycho was successful at the box office. It maintains a legacy in the annals of cinema and is considered by many to be a masterpiece. Based off the numbers on Box Office Mojo, so, take that with a grain of salt, IMDb. But I did the math. I'm not great at math, but it looks like it made about 39 times its budget. So that's great. Like that's a good ROI. And because of Psycho's success, it's replicated by filmmakers going forward, even to this day. Looking at you, De Palma. Looking at you. After the demise of the Hays Code and the institution of the MPA's rating system, we start getting more realistic and graphic horror films like Wes Craven and Travis Cunningham's Last House on the Left, I Spit on Your Grave, Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, many others. There are a lot more, but those are just two, I would say, important ones. And I'll go ahead and describe those two movies. So if you don't want the spoilers for Last House on the Left or Texas Chainsaw Massacre, skip ahead. Last House on the Left depicts a trio of criminals who brutally attack two teen girls in unrelenting detail, and then one girl's parents enacts a violent revenge on the criminals. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, on the other hand, is about a group of youths traveling to rural Texas. They keep breaking into this house and getting killed by the massive skin mask wearing, chainsaw wielding, nonverbal cannibal and his insane, probably inbred, definitely hungry family who lives there. Maybe if you just stopped going to their house, they wouldn't be eating you. Sally, I don't remember if her name was Sally, but Sally, I'm very bad with names. In Italy, slasher films are gory, vibrant red streak, misogynist extravaganza. Oh my God. I'm not even editing that out. I'm just going to try it again. In Italy, slasher films are gory, vibrant, red-streaked, misogynist extravaganzas. However, I'm simply not a fan of Italian horror. I've tried. I really, 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 really tried. I'm just not liking them. So I'm just mentioning them as they are important. But if you want like a history of the giallo film or Italian horror films, go find somebody else. I don't know. Moving on to 1978, brought the Father of the Slasher. Whoa, Father of the Slasher from John Carpenter and Deborah Hill. I feel like she doesn't get enough attention. She's important. Damn it. Michael Myers at just I guess spoilers for Halloween. Michael Myers at just 6 years old murders his 15-year-old sister Judith, Halloween night, 1963. He's subsequently institutionalized for the next 15 years until October 30th, 1978. He breaks free, returns home, steals a William Shatner mask, because of course he would. He's a Trekkie. And he goes on a killing spree. On his tail is his psychiatrist, Dr. Sam Loomis. We've heard that name before. Who's dragging poor Sheriff Lee Brackett along with him. Good girl Laurie Strode survives the silent stalker with her two minor charges, Tommy and Lindsay. And we're left with Carpenter's haunting synth score playing over empty shots of Haddonfield, knowing Michael is still out there. The boogeyman is still out there. Just like Psycho, Halloween has some deeply problematic issues. Again, I'm sorry for referencing it so much, but I do have an essay on the sex equals death trope that goes more into purity culture and the aspects that this film and others to point that the slasher copy and propagate it. Purity culture sucks. Just don't do it. It, along with Psycho, are terrible depictions of mental health as well, which I haven't gone into on any other previous essay. I'm going to go deep into that one because it's ableist and it's not cool, but more details on that later. Halloween was released as an R-rated film compared to a contemporary R-rated film. It's pretty tame, though it is in color and we do see nipples. Hitchcock could never. Halloween is one of the most successful independent films. Again, I used Box Office Mojo numbers, and I did the math myself, so I might be wrong, but it looks like it made 144 times its budget, which that is some fantastic ROI. Could you imagine? So anyway, Halloween success means it was replicated, which sounds just like what happened to Psycho. The tropes set up in Halloween are cemented by Shauna Cunningham and Victor Miller's 1980 film Friday the 13th. Friday the 13th is important. So I've read this in so many books and I've heard it in essays. So I just copied it. I just quoted Wikipedia because I just didn't want to hunt down a book that had a quote that I already knew to be true. It was the first independent slasher film to be acquired by a major motion picture studio. End quote from Wikipedia. Paramount acquired the rights to distribute Friday the 13th, even though it was made independently. They added a lot of money to its advertising budget. And this is 1980 when films had a much slower rollout and were actually on little reels of films. So it cost a lot of money to have wide releases and to print all of those reels of film to send them out to various theaters. So this was really important because Friday the 13th was the first slasher and one of the only slashers to get such a wide release because it had Paramount backing it. Because not too soon after this, then film will be a lot of like the more violent ones are going to go straight to VHS because there was a huge VHS boom not too long after this. So anyway, Friday the 13th is so important because it's one of the most seen slashers because of its wide theatrical release, because it had so much money backing it for distribution. In two ways, from the Box Office Mojo numbers again, I think it made about 26.5%. 26.5 times its budget, which is still wildly successful. So that's great. And like Halloween, Friday the 13th is rated R, But this time it shows a lot of gore. It shows the kills in their bloody detail in all of their Tom Savini splendor. And oh my gosh, can Tom Savini kill a person? Or, well, you know what I mean. Friday the 13th, spoilers for Friday the 13th, is about a group of relatively young counselors getting a lakeside summer camp set up for upcoming reopening. They are subsequently killed off one by a mentally unstable mother out for revenge for the death of her son at the same camp. I think it's like 22 years prior, 1957. Unlike Psycho and Halloween, this movie ends with a simple jump scare and no psychiatric exposition, no dehumanization of Mrs. Voorhees, no explanation beyond the one that she gave for her grief. So stick a pin in that. We'll come back around to the mental illness section later. Success breeds replication. Thus begins the slasher craze from 78 to 84, according to J. Kerswell. Unfortunately, it's often a matter of copy and paste for a payday without much consideration for substance. So we're going to talk about substance. But before we get to substance, I'm sorry, this is really long. I want to talk about censorship. And again, I'm just going to kind of speed run the highlights. Most of this information is coming from the NCAC, the National Coalition Against Censorship. So I'm going to be quoting the NCAC. That's what that is, National Coalition Against Censorship. All right, so 1907, quote NCAC, Chicago enacts the first movie censorship law in America. Cities and states around the nation create local censorship boards in the following years, resulting in a variety of different rules and standards. So to compare that to something more modern, it's like when a film is made and they might edit it a little differently for the Chinese release, right? Or the Japanese release. I'm sure Canada's probably similar to the US, but it might have a different rating, for instance, in Britain, even if it has like the same cut, right? But back in 1907, up until the 60s, not in the 60s, up until the 30s, different states had different censorship boards. In some places, particularly with large cities like Chicago, New York City, they might have their own censorship boards. So a film might be made and it might have an entire, maybe not an entirely different cut, but it might have to cut out something to get released in Mississippi versus something else to get released in Chicago, right? Because they had different standards. It's probably very annoying. 1915, quoting the NCAC, in Mutual Film Corporation versus Industrial Commission of Ohio, the Supreme Court holds that movies are not protected by the First Amendment. The ruling allows state and local boards to continue censoring films. 1922, quoting the NCAC, the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, MPPDA, is formed and led by former Postmaster General William Hayes. So that's why it's called, the production code is called the Hayes Code, colloquially. That's like a nickname for it. I feel like most people know it as the Hayes Code, but its actual name was the production code. And the MPPDA will eventually become the MPA later. So during the Great Depression, there's a lot of moral backlash, which was further aimed at Hollywood because of a series of scandals in the 1920s. This very prominent actress had died of an OD. There's the trial of an actor, Fatty Arbuckle, for manslaughter and possible sexual assault of a woman who's died, and that was her manslaughter. The murder of William Desmond Taylor and the death of Thomas Ince on William Randolph Hearst's yacht. And if you don't know William Randolph Hearst, much like Poulter, he's a guy who owned a lot of newspapers. So he kind of controlled the narrative. So that's interesting. We'll move on. In 1930, to quote the NCAC, the MPDEA creates a code to maintain social and community values in the production of silent, synchronized, and talking motion pictures, also called the also called the Production Code or the Hayes Code. End quote. And then in 1934, to quote the NCAC, the Catholic Legion of Decency is formed. More on them later. Joseph Breen, I almost said Neil Breen. Joseph Breen becomes the head of the new Production Code Authority, PCAC, Production Code Authority, which enforces the Hays Code. Under Breen, the PCAC is closely allied with the Legion of Decency. During this period, any company that releases a film without its seal of approval is subject to a fine. I didn't look up the fine. I have before, and I remember it being quite, like, if you use an inflation calculator, it was quite a lot, like a surprising amount. Okay, so 1952, to quote the NCAC, in Bernstein and Wilson, the Supreme Court strikes down a ban on Roberto Rossellini's film The Miracle, which the New York Board of Regents had found sacrilegious. For the first time, the Supreme Court holds that the motion picture had a significant medium for the communication of ideas and entitled to some First Amendment protection. So just remember that for 37 years, films were not entitled to First Amendment protection. And this case in 1952 is called the Miracle Decision because of the movie's title, The Miracle. 1968, the MPA's rating system, which is now GPGR NC-17, is instituted. And in 1984, the additional there was an additional rating to the rating system added, which was PG-13 because of Steven Spielberg. Not being facetious, it was literally because of Spielberg. He recommended because 2 of his films got such harsh backlash, which was Temple of Doom and Gremlins. Anyway, all right. So what is censorship? My definition, it's basically the government bodies deciding that their citizens can't be trusted to watch a movie. I'm oversimplifying, but like not by much. Film censorship is covered in the 3rd chapter of Julian Petley's book, Censorship, A Beginner's Guide. I found it very informative. Totally recommend this book. So here's what I learned. I'm just kind of surmising or summing up the 3rd chapter of this book. Okay, people in authority positions took issue with the wide accessibility that motion pictures had. Based on the codes they enacted and the language they used to argue their need, they felt that poor, uneducated people who they seemed to equate with criminals, like damn, would commit crimes if they saw a film depicting a crime or what they considered a sin. So it turns out the argument that violence in films, video games, music, lyrics, so on causes crime really is an age-old one. So as an example, I'll take a look at the first censorship board in the US. So I'm quoting Censorship, A Beginner's Guide by Julian Petley. Quote, local censorship was first introduced in 1907 in Chicago, where there were 116 Nickelodeons visited by some 100,000 customers per day. The Chicago Tribune condemned these cinemas for ministering to the lowest passions of childhood. And in 1907, the Chicago City Council passed an ordinance empowering the chief of police to issue permits for the exhibition of motion pictures. A permit could be refused if he felt that the film to be immoral or obscene or portrays depravity, criminality, or lack of virtue of class of citizens of any race, color, creed, or religion, or tends to produce a breach in the peace or riots, or purports to represent any hanging, lynching, or burning of a human being. So that's a thing. On the side, I just want to know that these people were so against sex, even in education, because I think at some point I read that they were this is going to go to the Catholic Legion of Decency I'm going to talk about later, but they were blocking educational films about VDs, which are like STDs. Crazy. But they were so against that, and depictions of what they considered to be crimes and sins. And what I mean by this film couldn't films couldn't show murder in 1940 in the way Tom Savini could in 1980. However, watching films in the 1930s, do you know what I notice a lot of? Men hitting women. And those men aren't even considered the bad guys. Domestic violence, sure, totally fine. A married couple sharing a bed, sinful. Back then, these groups weren't concerned with juvenile delinquency or protecting the children either. I talk a lot more about this on my Sex Equals Death trope, but to explain real quickly, childhood innocence is a social construct, just like virginity. And further, it's one that didn't really exist until pretty recently. We couldn't really think of the children until we had child labor laws and vaccines and antibiotics that reduced child mortality rate, because up until pretty recently, children weren't really anything special. They were, if they survived, little workers. Then suddenly, these important, precious little idiots who need constant protection from bad words and gay people, I guess. Woohoo. Film censorship was about making the Catholic League of Decency happy, specifically during the production code era of 1934 to the mid-1960s. Before that, a lot of this basis of censorship, even in courts, was on the grounds that a film was considered sacrilegious. And separation of church and state, you say, though. Since when? Literally no, since when? Find me a time. The religious majority is running things. Don't fool yourself into thinking otherwise. And that was very true for my 21st century, for the 20th century, and it's true now. I took the synopsis of a book because I thought it kind of really quickly explained my point. It's called Sin and Censorship, the Catholic Church and the Motion Picture Industry by Frank Walsh. And again, this is just the synopsis of the book. Like, you read the back, this is what the back of the book says. During World War I, Catholic Church blocked the distribution of government-sponsored BD prevention films, initiating an era of attempts by the church to censor the movie industry. This book is entertaining and engrossing account of those efforts, how they evolved, and what effect they had on the movie industry, and why they were eventually abandoned. Frank Walsh tells how the church's influence in Hollywood grew through the 1920s and reached its peak during the 1930s when the film industry allowed Catholics to dictate the production code, which became the industry's self-censorship system, and the Legion of Decency was established by the church to blacklist any films it considered offensive. With the industry's Joe Breen, we talked about him earlier, a Catholic layman, cutting movie scenes during film production, and the League of Decency threatening to ban movies after release, the Catholic Church played a major role in determining what Americans saw and didn't see on screen during the golden age of Hollywood, which is wild. And if you look at, like, in 1934 to 68 officially, the Hays Code is a list of do's, don'ts, and be carefuls, and a general state of principles, which is like, just kind of looking at some of them, essentially, one of them is like, you can't ridicule the clergy. You can't depict childbirth. You can't talk about sex hygiene or venereal diseases. You can't depict a couple that's not of the same race. So, like, a black person and a white person can't be in a relationship together. You definitely can't depict queer people. Yeah, there's just a lot of, I mean, some of them, like, you can't depict children's sexual organs. Yes, that one I agree with wholeheartedly. Still a rule. Should be. But there's other ones where it's like, what are you going for here? Like, you're not allowed to use profanity. There's just a lot of stuff. So censorship, to me, is conservative. How it's done in the US is definitely conservative anyway, because censorship was spawned from the moral majority, essentially. It's puritanical, fascist-leaning old men who think that their unearned feelings of superiority and their idea of right and wrong are absolutely the only way to view things. Newsflash, as Billy Loomis said in Scream, you don't blame the movies. Movies don't create psychos. Movies make psychos more creative. For whatever reason, these people are so ready to blame video games and movies, music, art, but they never want to blame the adolescent white boy who brought the firearm in whatever place and killed people. No, it's not his fault. It's the art he was listening to, watching, playing. They are held to no accountability, no blame. We can't blame men for their bad behavior. God forbid. Anyway, for decades, the Film Censorship Board, the PCA, literally answered to the Catholic League of Decency. They censored films for everyone. Their concern was not with the children, it was with their interpretation of moral decency, and they decided for everyone what was acceptable to view or not. Tastes and beliefs change over time, even censors. The 60s saw a rise and change. The election of John F. Kennedy to president, civil rights movement, second wave feminism, sexual revolution, and more. The code of old was just that, old. The production code was outdated. So in 1968, the Hays Code is officially replaced with a rating system that gave the audience an idea of what to expect. Today, the ratings are G, general admittance, PG, parental guidance suggested, R, restricted to 17 and older unless accompanied by an adult, NC-17, further restricted, so no one under 18 is allowed in the film at all, regardless of anything, and PG-13, which was enacted in 1984, which is not restricted, by the way. Like, an 11-year-old can go and buy a ticket for a PG-13 movie. It's not against any rules. All right. I worked in a movie theater for a long time, so those ratings come from my memory of that. All right. The ratings board is a kind of secretive. So to quote the MPA's website, the ratings are determined by the Classification and Ratings Administration, CARA, via a board comprised of an independent group of parents. And then the MPA's website sent me to another website called filmratings.com. And these parents, so quote, these parents advise, these parents give advance cautionary warnings to families about a movie's content. The CARA's mission is to afford parents tools they need to make informed decisions about what their children watch. But keep in mind that this affects what studios will fund and make. So definitely really affects the landscape of cinema. Movies are rated on a case-by-case basis, and arguments can be made to lower their rating. It's a whole complicated thing, and according to the MPAA site, they focus really specifically on 5 things: language, violence, nudity, sex, and drugs. They do look at other things, but those are kind of the big ones. And notice how they really put all this push for this whole system is about protecting the children. Like, sure, Dan. Sure. As I said, times change. What might have been an R in 1975 might get you a PG-13 today, or vice versa. Well, I get you a PG because PG-13 didn't exist in 75. See Jaws for reference. As an example, in the 70s, no one thought twice about letting a child see characters smoking. Today, the same thing will get you an R. Why? Because times change. Big Tobacco had to admit that smoking causes cancer, so now you can't show a kid that smoking is cool anymore. Sorry, Joe Camel. Get a new job. As this rant pertains to slashers, well, slashers are everything these boring, chastity belt wearing grumps hate: alcohol, drugs, sex, nudity, violence. Shudder. Funny that the ones having sex and doing the drugs are the ones getting killed. Yay, subconscious conservative propaganda. Woohoo! The production code from 1934 to 1960 is the reason we have proto-slashers. Slashers simply could not exist in the US until the downfall of the Hays Code. Then it was a matter of evolution for the subgenre to find its footing, from Last House on the Left to Spit in Your Grave, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, etc. to Halloween. It took about 7 years, almost exactly. We started off maybe a bit too gritty and brutal, which makes sense. The gates of censorship were open, and filmmakers can now do anything they and their practical effects team can dream of. And it makes sense that they swung a little bit too far the other way, and it took 10 years to find that balance. Once Halloween came out, it took about 2 years for Friday the 13th to copy it and get a wide theatrical release to cement the tropes that Halloween set up. Thus, the censors were about to be inundated with their nightmares, but don't worry, they'll protect the children. All right, so let's talk about learned bias. There are learned biases. Of course they are. We don't come into this world ready to hate insert demographic of people. We learn that. We learn it through our family, our peers, education, media, news, art, and a million little interactions. Just like we learn how to gender. Gender socialization is real. Both of these things have aspects that are innocuous and aspects that are extremely harmful. For harmful examples, see purity culture and racism. Pertaining to this conversation about slashers, my reasoning to bring it up are twofold. First, some fears are culturally learned. Secondly, a lot of aspects of slashers are influenced by the writer and director's bias in negative ways. Once again, see purity culture and negative perceptions of mental illness, also casting practices. We'll discuss these things later. In the US, we are taught to view houseless people as alcoholic, lazy people who have ruined their own lives, but factually, the data does not reflect that. In the US, we are taught to see addiction and drug use much the same way: individual responsibility, bad kids and adults making bad choices. But Merton's strain theory says otherwise, as does the Mayo Clinic. In the US, we are taught to see premarital sex and being gay as the worst of sins, if my abstinence-only education in the 21st century has anything to go by. So that's my point. My point is that for as much as Carpenter wants to say Halloween isn't conservative, it kind of is. And I'm completely sure it was done totally subconsciously, because Carpenter and Hill, for as liberal as their movies clearly are still inundated with these beliefs. You have to realize you're being lied to before you can confront the lie. And Carpenter hadn't put his sunglasses on yet. He was still asleep. That's a They Live reference. These messages and more infiltrate the sleeping minds of writers and directors for generations. And in fact, these ideas are still around. Yikes. All right. So what is scary? Horror taps into fears. With slashers, one of two basic ways. With most horrors, actually one to two basic ways, but specifying towards slasher. Fear of the unknown. You go to the killer. You travel and get caught by hillbillies, southerner, big outdoorsy, probably inbred, definitely mutated man, right? Fear from subverting a safe space. The killer comes to you. Scary man breaks into the house in the suburbs. It's more difficult to do a slasher in the suburbs because slashers, like all horror, rely on isolation and not being able to get away and get help. Note, in the 1980s, horror movies, often the car won't start. We talked about this before. So again, it's hard to have technology in a slasher. Those things kind of clash. And it's fun seeing writers and directors, especially today, work to try to create a situation where someone can't get help. What's scarier than the place that you feel safest becoming the most dangerous place? That's terrifying. Home should be safe. Sheriff Brackett said in Halloween, more fancy talk, doctor. Do you know what Haddonfield is? Families, children, all lined up and down in rows, up and down these streets. You're telling me they're lined up for a slaughterhouse? And Halloween works because we have the police and the psychiatrist already looking for Michael. It's just a matter of finding him, right? And he only kills over one night. So but it's hard to do it in a suburb. So side note, that's why slashers have the killing spree take place over a single night, right? Yeah. I'm repeating myself. That was an accident. I'll move on. Okay. There are different experiences that can be tapped into. Not everyone goes on road trips. Not everyone goes camping. But we all have a home, though not all of us live in a house in the suburbs. We all walk down the street at night. A movie about people getting stalked and killed in the woods will probably be more scary to someone who goes camping or lives in a rural area. Conversely, a movie about cannibal hillbillies in Texas is likely more scary to people who live in a metropolitan city because people who actually live in Texas likely aren't afraid of their own inaccurate depictions. So you can tap into people's fear of known or fear of unknown. Basically, what's scary for one person might not be scary for another. So slashers can have thousands of kinds of ways to set up and pay off that work differently for different audiences. It might seem narrow, but it's actually pretty broad. Subgenre, I don't know. There's a lot of slashers. They're still being made today, although not as much. Anyway, I'm going to go into more detail about the rule slasher film later, aka Hicksploitation. Apparently there's a name for it. I learned that yesterday. As it pertains to slashers, there's also differences in violence and fear based on gender. Hear me out. It stands to reason that, especially in the past, because men and women have different life experiences and expectations, that different fears and traumas would arise. Men fear man versus science, internal evils, war, because men were going off to war. They were the ones allowed to get educated and work. They often worked in mines and factories or making bombs. They were the ones that saw how greed could lead to terrible inventions or unethical decisions that killed people. Also, men are more violent. Women fear men, maybe children, pregnancy, family, the home, because for centuries, women were confined to the home, to housework, and to being a wife and mother. One of the many reasons that the protagonist of the slasher is a final girl, because people are more likely to fear and they're more on board watching a girl in fear than they are a boy. I talk about that a little later. Realistically, anyone can be the victim of a homicide, and in real life, men are actually murdered more than women. Even if you exclusively look at serial killers, women and men are killed almost equally, with women unfortunately getting killed just a little bit higher rates, but not by much. But keep in mind, people doing the murder are overwhelmingly men. Much overwhelmingly, especially when we look at serial killers. These ideas are culturally ingrained in us from a young age. Sometimes it's not subtle at all. Stranger danger, for instance. The images of abducted white girls compared to boys. Back in the 50s, boys would have grown up with a draft hanging over their heads. White girls would have been inundated with purity culture. Different fears would develop from that. Hell, an entirely different perception of the world would develop from that. Please note, overwhelmingly, movies are written and directed by men, especially in the past. So their stories, voices, worldviews, perceptions, etc., are the ones that dominate the film and the language of cinema. Cinema is the male agenda. Male agenda. Fucking patriarchy. So I'm going to quote an excerpt from Women Make Horror by Alison Peirce. In 1983, Joan Russ, so I guess I'm actually quoting Jane Russ, explores suppression of women's writing in society, culture, and academia. She argues, so guess I'm quoting Jane Russ through Alison Peirce, a mode of understanding life which willfully ignores half the human consciousness can do so only at the peril of thoroughly distorting the rest. A mode of understanding literature which can ignore the private lives of half the human race is not incomplete. It is distorted through and through. Even when the film is, or end quote, even when the film is focused on the female story, it's often created by men, so to me generally lacks authenticity. For example, Carrie, Barbarian, The Stranger Chapter 1, The Craft, etc. How does all this affect the slasher? Well, men are biased to see women as the weaker sex. We are beaten over the head in the US with the narrative, with the image of passivity, weakness, of what a victim, white victim, should look like. The men making horror movies just fed into that, generally without interrogating it. Some for better, some for worse, they maintain the status quo, which is odd because horror as a genre is the best medium to question the status quo and confront our cultural norms, particularly the unjust ones. The slasher films propelled this narrative of sexually active teen girl getting killed by a mentally unstable, often rural man. And oh boy, I have a lot to say about that because I'm a wordy witch. I'm just saying we could do better in the victim shaming front, America. Do better. All right, so serial killers. Unfortunately, slasher films are movies about serial killers. Bare bones, they're movies about serial killers. Often they take inspiration from real life events, but not always. And I don't want to get too into real serial killers, but I do think it's worth discussing them a little bit. So as a side, I personally don't like films based on real life serial killers using their names and depicting on film the murder of real human beings. That to me is a disgusting form of exploitation. Inspiration is fine, but exploitation to me is in bad taste. So further, I don't think it's morally right to glorify serial killers. With that having been said, let's talk about serial killers. I did read up on serial killers and got really sidetracked and down a rabbit hole. And I want to keep this to information that pertains to help explain slashers. So murder has existed since man. It's existed in most mythologies, notably because a lot of oral storytelling functions as a way to communicate rules and social conduct to the next generation. It also acted as a way to ensure good behavior. Christianity is an easy example. Murder is against one of the 10 commandments, which are also taught to people and helps ensure people won't commit this sin, otherwise they will go to hell. Religion acted as a lesson and a threat. Horror movies are, in their most basic form, a cautionary tale. The history of serial killers is harder to track, and I tried. I went and looked at Wikipedia. They have a list of serial killers before the 1900s. I regret this. I really do. Ignore my smile. To get an idea. So here's my takeaway, and just an opinion based on observation. Our relationship to death and even to murder, and more to the point, murderers, has changed over time, much like censorship. There's less government-sanctioned torture and murders and war and assassination and uprising and disease and famine and religious nonsense like the Inquisition and also colonialism. And also we see more people as people rather than property. So whether there's a better understanding of science and mental health, I bring this up because it seems like a lot of serial killers in the olden times were mythologized by labeling them as supernatural beings, like the werewolf of blank, calling certain people like witches or vampires and stuff. Although I'm telling you, there was a lot of werewolves. Today, serial killers are still mythologized. Jack the Ripper, Son of Sam, Night Stalker, so on. Giving serial killers these nicknames seems to have existed for centuries and looks like it's typically done by reporters. And I do feel like this is a glorification of the person and their crimes, and it's done to sell papers. The news is not just a warning. These stories get ratings and sell papers, or today get clicks. And people have an appetite for cruelty, which just helps keep people, I mean, I don't know, like naming a hurricane, it kind of shows that it helps keep people safe because it makes people take the hurricane more seriously. But I don't know if that could be said for serial killers. I actually don't know. Didn't look it up. Question mark on that one. Reporting plays an integral role to the immortalization of some crimes, and more specifically, some serial killers. Jack the Ripper and Ted Bundy really come to mind. I'm sure most of you have heard of Jack the Ripper and or have seen a movie or documentary or listened to a podcast or something about his crimes. He killed at least 5 women. Yeah, you don't actually have to call them prostitutes. You can call them women. And there's evidence, by the way, that only one of them was a sex worker. And also, it's 2024. Can we use the term sex worker? Jesus. Anyway, he killed 5 women in 1888 in London. They're known as the Whitechapel murders. So I want to quote this excerpt from Murder, Media, and Mythology, the Impact of the Media's Reporting on the Whitechapel Murders Had on National Identity, Social Reform, and the Myth of Jack the Ripper by Greg Jones, but he's pulling from the work of Walkowitz. All right. So, quote, "If it was not for the sensationalist journalism, which would come to be a hallmark of reporting of the Whitechapel murders, the murders would not have had the renaissance they had and continue to have. In the 1880s, there was comparatively little to report on, so moral panics were bound to have been capitalized on. With the article of 1885, the Maiden Tribune of the Modern Babylon, the blueprint for using scandal and moral outrage to sell paper was born." So just 3 years earlier, there was this news article that was about, I think, sex trafficking of minors, and it would cause this huge backlash and got laws changed. So 3 years later, at this point, people selling newspaper realize that these types of stories get a huge sales for their papers. And so obviously it would make sense for them to create these sensationalized headlines and tell these crazy stories about these serial killers because people have an appetite for cruelty. And this was just a few years before kind of the dawn of cinema. Keep that in mind. So this trend of sensationalizing serial killers continued until checks watch. Still, the term serial killer was coined. Okay, I was looking at Britannica. There's a lot of arguments about this. So it says 1974, maybe by this FBI agent. But either way, or whatever way, it started getting used in the mid 70s. So some of these proto-slashers were made before the term serial killer even existed. In the 1970s, there was a rise in serial killers. You can read more about this in a Vox article by Zachary Crockett, who takes research from Dr. Mike Amond, entitled "What Data on 3,000 Murderers and 10,000 Victims Tells Us About the Serial Killer." Okay, so I read this article on Rolling Stone by Brianna Ehrlich. Why were there so many serial killers between the 1970s and 2000s, and where do they go? I'm just going to sum up what the article said in my own words. So why were there so many serial killers? Like, why was there a rise in the 70s? And this is my summation of this article. This is likely due to the rise caused by there being easier targets from increased urbanization, counterculture, drugs, more homelessness, hitchhiking, and more trust. It was a more trusting time because all these serial killers of the past, people became more fearful and new businesses arose like home security systems and pepper spray. So the past serial killers effectively made it more difficult for there to be serial killers in the future. And there is a Northeastern Global News article by Cody Mellon Klein. Why are there fewer serial killers now than there used to be? So this is my summation of this article, not quoting directly, just summing it up. Around the turn of the millennium, we have better technology and harsher prison sentences. So that curb the presence of serial killers. Basically, they're getting caught earlier now and they don't get out of prison as often. Okay, so to bring this back to movies, the dawn of filmmaking happened around the time of Jack the Ripper. And he is one of the most infamous serial killers, which honestly sounds horrible to say. So now the part I can finally talk about proto-slashers. Okay. In these proto-slashers, as in literature around this time, it seems to me that murder in film and books was kind of portrayed in like a murder mystery, sort of like noir type way. I saw 4 basic trends. This is just my personal opinion. All right. So we have a gothic sensibility. We have people staying in an old big house disappearing one by one. For example, see Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, Cat and the Canaries, Spiral Staircase, Night of Terror. Our second type is procedural. We have people investigating the killings, like Sherlock Holmes and the Scarlet Claw or Fritz Lang's M. We have art, like our third one, art. Kind of self-referential about exploitation and voyeurism in cinema and art. So, for examples, almost all Hitchcock films, Peeping Tom and A Bucket of Blood. And then we have a real life. So films that are based on real life murders as our fourth type. And we have The Lodger, which there's a 1927 and 1944 version. The Hitchhiker, Night of the Hunter, The Town That Dreaded Sundown, Psycho. All right, so most proto-slashers, I would say, don't really resemble what a slasher film would look like in the 1980s. It's not until the Hays Code is spaced out and replaced by the MPA's rating system in 1968 that we start getting slasher films that are really gory because, simply put, they couldn't have gore in them. They couldn't even depict the murder, really. They had to depict it in a very kind of specific way to get around the censors. Even now, filmmakers will go out of their way to make blood like black or green or blue, any color other than red, to get a lower rating, which is kind of wild. Still perfectly fine showing abuse, but blood, God forbid, literally, apparently, in their opinion. To quote, whoa, I don't know why I said it like that. To quote Heidi Honeycutt's I Spit on Your Grave. No, I messed that up. To quote Heidi Honeycutt's I Spit on Your Celluloid, The History of Women Directing Horror Movies, which was a fantastic book that came out in 2024. So, quote, as we know them today, horror films did not exist until the second half of the 20th century. The things we associate with horror, like slasher films, final girls, gore, excessive blood, nudity, and sex, and practical makeup effects, were not the norm for cinema. It wasn't until the 1920s that feature-length horror films became recognizable, and not until the 1930s that classic icons like Dracula and Frankenstein's monster became known to the audience in a meaningful way. And it wasn't until the 1960s that films like Psycho, Blood Feast, Night of the Living Dead ushered in an entirely new type of horror cinema, unfettered by the change of the studio code, theatrical monopolies, traditional conservative Victorian sensibilities. End quote. Too true. Sorry, had to take a drink. Okay, so we got to talk about serial killers again. I'm so sorry. I really don't want to, but I feel like I have to talk about methodology. So going back to that Vox article by Sam Crockett, who was looking at research from Dr. Mike Amond with data on 3,000 murderers and 10,000 victims tells us about the serial killer. Okay, I'm just summing up the article, not quoting directly. A lot of serial killers are financially motivated in real life, and the number one weapon used is actually a firearm. A lot of serial killers are part of gang activity too. So obviously, these types of serial killers are not really taken as inspiration when making a slasher movie. The types of murderers that inspire slashers are those who in real life kill for gratification. The sexual assailant, I guess. Usually a bladed weapon or strangulation. In this case, the killer is usually, though not always, a cishet white man killing women. So according to that article, an article on the University of Michigan website, Serial Killer Statistics by Taylor Stacy, approximately 92% of serial killers are men. And she goes on to say that, quote, the theory regarding why there are more male serial killers rests in recurring findings in clinical psychology that men are more likely to have paraphilias, which are atypical turn-ons, than women. So according to the Vox article by Crockett, what's it called again? What 3,000 murderers and 10,000 victims tells us about serial killers. Again, I have all of my sources linked below. Serial killers also prefer younger victims. About 18% of all victims fall under the age of 18, while just over 10% are over the age of 60. that's confusing. Let me just say, specifically looking at the chart, 18.1% of victims are between 10 and 19. 27% of victims, which is the highest, are between ages 20 and 29, and then drops off a little bit to 17.7% of victims are ages 30 to 39. So as it pertains to high school and college age victims in these movies, that does seem to be accurate to real life, as the targeting of female victims, especially if the killer is sexually motivated. Quoting the serial killer statistics on the University of Michigan website by Taylor Stacy, financial gain is the largest single motive for all serial killings, but close behind is serial killing for sexual pleasure, which comes to 27.3%. Insane. So I rewrote this section a couple times based on those aforementioned articles and Wikipedia research, and being a chick of a certain age who listens to the podcasts. And I've come to the conclusion that the image that is portrayed in media of what a serial killer isn't exactly reflective of real life. In movies, most slashers are knife or pointy weapon wielding madmen killing both teen boys and teen girls. And the image of a depraved, hyper charming man who kills young women isn't most serial killers. Those do exist, but they're outliers. But those are generally the most notorious ones. And isn't that awful to say? Once again, quoting from Serial Killer Statistics by Taylor Stacy for an article on the University of Michigan website. Americans seem to have a strange fascination with serial killers. For decades, we as a nation have been enthralled by the idea that someone who kills for pleasure. In 1979, the trial of Ted Bundy was among one of the first to be televised nationally and was watched by millions of Americans. In the 21st century, documentaries chronicling the murders of America's most prolific killers are some of the most watched on streaming services. And isn't that awful? Oh, end quote. Isn't that awful? Was me saying that, not her. Okay. Oh, shoot. Mouse clicking. Okay. I don't really know what my point is, if I'm being honest. People who need to fear the most are houseless people and sex workers, because overwhelmingly in this day and age, they are the targets of serial killers, that or family, though it's kind of hard to plan for poison or a family annihilator. So what I'm saying is most serial killers are not Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer. To segue a little, it seems like most killers who target both men and women typically use firearms. And something I noticed being of interest to this conversation is that men who are attacked had a higher likelihood of surviving than women who are attacked. And by attacked, I mean shot. And this is relevant, I think, because remember the final girl, less talked about, is the secondary survivor. It's overwhelmingly a guy in movies. So it's rare to see two girls to make it to the end of a movie, with exceptions being like Slumber Party Massacre. And it's even more of an exception to see a cast of survivors, with an example being Scream. Typically, you just have the final girl, and if there is a secondary survivor, it will likely be a guy. Usually her love interest. So I found an example in real life of a killer who used firearms or whatever weapon of convenience who would break into people's houses. I will say, and I went back and forth. I'm like, should I say who it is? I guess I will. It's Richard Ramirez. And he would break into a home. If there was a man there, he would kill them first. And then he would attack the woman who was home, often sexually assaulting them. Sometimes he would kill them, sometimes he would not. If there was a child in the home, he did not attack them. This is relevant, I think, because it demonstrates what most slasher films do, actually. They have their masked madmen kill the guy, often post-sex, and then linger on a semi-nude woman as she's attacked for a far longer scene, and it is more focused on her fear and attempt to survive. I go into a lot more detail about this and a lot of quantifiable data that supports this through a number of studies on my essay on the sex equals death trope. So I'll just quote my conclusion from that essay. So quoting myself here, I'm concluding that males are more often victims in slashers, but women are shown in fear longer and are more likely to experience violence in a state of undress, which often makes their death scenes longer and more memorable. This intentionally or not relates sex to violence. It associates sex and violence, which simply put is an unhealthy connection. Otherwise, just take my word for it. Okay, so what most of these films don't depict is the sexually motivated killer. Usually it's the opposite. It's a sexually repulsed killer, which is not reflective of real life at all. It's not always the case, but I feel like that's something to consider. And to be honest, I don't know, again, if I have a point in all this observation. There are bad people out there, both men and women, but mostly men. Sometimes the people who are close to you hurt you the worst way possible. Sometimes a stranger can be dangerous. Most targets are easy targets, houseless people, the mentally ill, sex workers. But that doesn't mean a middle-class woman walking home from work can't be murdered. And I guess my point is, you never know. Things happen. There's definitely patterns that the FBI, criminologists, psychologists, social scientists of all kinds try to figure out, but we really don't understand how these people can do such evil. Not be such evil, do such evil. Looking at you, Loomis. And maybe it's a good thing we don't understand, but in movie, characters are typically given some kind of motive, and men writing and directing them give them one. So regardless of if it reflects real life and those cinematic portrayals, regardless of if it reflects real life, cinematic portrayals begin to be what people subconsciously accept as truth. But that's just my opinion. All right, so let's talk about actual slasher killers. Wait, about fake slasher. Well, no, about killers in the slasher movie. So not real life people, but fictitious killers. Does that make sense? I don't know. I tried to make a chart of the different types of motives that serial kill or that slasher killers have. It didn't work. I came up with a couple different things. So we have mental illness, like Psycho and Silent Rage, compulsion, like M or the movie Angst, being trans or raised as a gender they were not assigned to at birth, like Dressed to Kill or Sleepaway Camp, being deformed, like Hell Night, Hills Have Eyes, Phenomena, just being evil, Halloween, because I like to for funsies. I think that's kind of my favorite one because they're just very entertaining, like Child's Play and Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon. Revenge, like Friday the 13th, Terror Train, Oedipal complex or sexual dysfunction, like Psycho or Blood Rage. A dude who just wants to kill women because he's a disgusting, violent misogynist, such as Pieces, Maniac, Summer Party Massacre, most Giallo films, and then realistic? The Hitcher, Night of the Hunter, Summer Party Massacre. Okay, so let's go further into some of these. I feel like some of them were kind of obvious. Other ones I'll go further into. All right, so let's talk about mental illness in the slasher film, aka ableism. Oh God, let me take a sip. Okay. So, warning, I am not a mental health professional. All right. So the trope of the mentally unstable killer is prominent in so many slashers, including two of the most replicated, Psycho and Halloween. So I'm going to talk about Psycho and Halloween and get real deep into this. So, okay. In Psycho, we have a deeply misogynist take on mental illness from the 1950s. Norman I'm going to quote a lot of this. So Norman tells Marion after she clucks her thick tongue and suggests, oh, very delicately, she needs me. It's not as if she were a raving maniac, or a raving thing. She just goes a little mad sometimes. We all go a little mad sometimes. And then later we have Dr. Richmond expo dumping. It's like a 10-minute scene. It's a really long quote. I'm not going to do the whole thing. He explains that Norman isn't a transvestite. He tried to be his mother. The mind houses two personalities. The dominant one has one. The mother half of Norman's mind. Norman murdered his mother and her lover. He was dangerously disturbed after his father died. His mother was a clinging, demanding woman. Now, he was never all Norman, but he was often all mother. If he felt a strong attraction to another woman, the mother side of him would go wild. He was aroused by Marion. He wanted her. That set off the jealous mother, and mother killed the girl. Yada, yada, yada. We know the scene. So I go a lot more into detail on this in my trans representation and horror essay, but to quickly sum up the essay, combining the reveal that Norman is wearing a dress, is mentally unstable, and a killer merges those three things and creates an association between them for the audience, which unfortunately was replicated by a lot of filmmakers for decades, further linking mental illness, gender nonconformity, or transness to homicide. And that's very incorrect and harmful. Additionally, once it's revealed that Norman is the killer, he doesn't talk anymore. He's diagnosed. We don't hear from him, though. We're told by an oddly seen chewing psychiatrist what Norman told him. He loses his autonomy. Yes, the mother side talks, but that's not Norman, actually. That's the mother side, and that's slightly different, as we're told by the chewing psychiatrist. And this is common. There are quite a lot of horror movies where once the killer is revealed, they suddenly don't speak anymore, regardless how stable or erudite they were before, which was weird. The last thing I want to say in Psycho is that it goes heavily into momism. Again, I have more detail on this elsewhere, but this idea that Norman's mom was demanding, overbearing woman and his father wasn't in the picture is probably something you've heard about with real life serial killers if you listen to any podcasts, and it's total bullshit. And it plays into this misogynist stigma that dates back at least to the 1950s masculinity crisis. Yes, apparently there was a masculinity crisis in the 1950s, and let me just stop myself from rolling my eyes all the way back into my existence with that one. Mom loves her son too much, he'll turn into a queer, weak sissy. Mom doesn't love her son enough, he'll turn out to be a serial killer. Like, do men not have any control of their own behavior? Women are responsible for just all of their actions? Like, damn. Men who kill women are misogynist pigs who probably hate their mothers just for existing as a woman. Let's move on. Segue to Halloween. Halloween isn't doing much better in 1978 than Psycho did in 1960. Woohoo. So we have Dr. Sam Loomis, who expositions to Sheriff Lee Brackett when he's told he'll need to do more than a fancy talk to convince, I don't know why I did in that accent, to convince Brackett to stay all night hunting for Myers with him. So, quoting Loomis, I watched him for 15 years, sitting in a room, staring at the wall, not seeing the wall, but looking past the wall, looking at this very night, inhumanly patient, waiting for some secret silent alarm to trigger him off. Death has come to your little town, Sheriff. Now you can either ignore it, you can help me stop it. Loomis continues the fancy talking. Again, I don't know why I'm doing that accent, but I keep doing it. Damn. I met him 15 years ago. I was told there was nothing left, no reason, no conscience, no understanding, and even the most rudimentary sense of life or death, of good or wrong. I met the 6-year-old child. I messed up that. That's fine. I'm just going to move past it. I met this 6-year-old child with his blank, pale, emotionless face and the blackest eyes, the devil's eyes. I spent 8 years trying to reach him and then another 7 trying to keep him locked up because I realized what was living behind that boy's eyes was purely and simply evil. At the end of the film, Laurie asks, was it the boogeyman? To which Loomis, the psychiatrist, replies, as a matter of fact, it was. More example of Loomis's dehumanizing language. He's talking to Nurse Marion Crane. Reference. Don't you think it would be better if we refer to it as him? Loomis replies, if you say so. She responds, your compassion is overwhelming, doctor. Brackett and Loomis, after seeing the dog at the old Myers house, Brackett says, a man wouldn't do that. Loomis replies, this isn't a man. And then lastly, when Michael breaks out, Loomis screams, he's gone from here. The evil is gone. All right. This franchise is complicated. I don't want to try to explain it. I have 3 videos explaining Halloween that amount to nearly 3 hours of content. So I'm not going to get bogged down in those details. Let's just be straight. In the 1978 film, Michael Myers is a man, just a man, full stop, just a human man. Boy, did they go back and forth on that later, but they definitely started out as being just a man, retcons and cults and mob mentality and blah, 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 ignored. His psychiatrist, Dr. Sam Loomis, using this dehumanizing language regarding him is unprofessional and outright vile and is wildly ableist. Michael Myers is depicted inarguably as mentally ill. He escaped from a psychiatric hospital, for crying out loud. When the audience is told by the doctor that he is pure evil, like in Psycho, how gender nonconformity, mental illness, and homicidal violence are associated, in Halloween, mental illness, homicidal violence, and evil are intrinsically linked. Further, like Norman, Michael doesn't talk. He lacks autonomy to explain his actions, and they are explained by a psychiatrist who diagnoses Michael as incurable evil, death, the boogeyman. Historically, there's been a lack of mental health awareness. More importantly, there was a severe lack of empathy. It's one thing that it took centuries for the human or to understand the human mind, which we still don't fully. It's entirely another to dehumanize people and stigmatize what's not understood simply because it's not understood. What often happens when we don't understand, we demonize. It's natural to want to understand evil actions, but films create a further stigma for people who are mentally ill and, might I add, innocent, as in not killers. Some serial killers may have some mental illness that meets the DSM's diagnostic criteria, but overwhelmingly they lack the legal definition of insanity or diminished capacity. I'm not a lawyer, I don't know. I'm going to say insanity, but it feels mean to say it that way. Because they're usually organized killers. One of the many reasons they weren't caught in the past that quickly. What I want to emphasize is that mental illness very rarely leads someone to kill, let alone be able to get away with that crime long enough to be a serial killer. These people, serial killers, are depraved. But it's not due to a psychiatric breakdown or something they can't control. They know what they're doing, they plan, they follow through, and they cover up their crimes so that they can continue to take the lives and hurt people because they actively want to. They're aware. That's disgusting. That's not mental illness. And to give filmmakers the benefit of the doubt here, I don't know why I said it so mean, but to give filmmakers the benefit of the doubt here, this plays into the learned biases that I spoke about earlier. I don't know when mental illness became stigmatized, but it has been for an incredibly long time. We all saw Queen Charlotte at Bridgerton story. We know. Just Googling it, looking at the AI overview. Should I quote that? I put it in quotes. Who am I quoting? I don't know. It's AI overview. I'm sure I'm quoting someone. Mental health has been stigmatized for thousands of years across many cultures and societies. That's what the artificial intelligence has told me, so it must be true. Again, it's in large part due to a lack of understanding, also religion. Gotta love religion. Fritz Lang's 1931 film M. The reason Fritz Lang's gives for his character being so depraved is purely and simply uncontrollable compulsion. And the film's climax is good old-fashioned mob justice. The town catches the killer and puts him on trial as the killer argues for his life. I originally wanted to quote this whole thing, but honestly, I think it's just really wrong and kind of unnecessary. But basically, he's calling them criminals, and they are, but they're not murderers. And he's, kind of crying out that he can't control what he's doing, and he doesn't like doing it. He's unable to stop himself. Okay, so if you're making a movie about a man who's killing people, it's likely easy to think, oh, he must be a madman. For reference, see Madman, Maniac, Psycho, Schizoid. The truth was something that in the 70s and 80s and even in the 21st century, we weren't ready to face. They wanted easy outs, chalk it up to mentally unstable stranger, killing poor teen to early 20s sexually active youth. Stranger danger, when in reality, the person those young women should fear the most statistically is the person they're in a relationship with, living with, friends with, trust. You're much more likely to get killed by someone you know than someone you don't. People who are mentally ill are unlikely to be killers or even violent. They're statistically more likely to be the victim of a crime and also the victims of police brutality. Does that. And that's not even getting into intersectional issues. Yikes. A noteworthy film I want to bring up is Blood Rage, which I believe was shot in 83 but not released until 87. One of the most realistic slashers, which is weird, and I assume unintentionally. So there are spoilers for Blood Rage. They're identical twins. One is institutionalized for the crime, the other committed. On Thanksgiving, he breaks out and goes home, much like Michael Myers. That same day, his brother goes on another killing spree. Well, why is this realistic? Because the mentally unwell guy in the movie is not the killer. He's the targeted victim. That's reality. Something I realized in my 20s is that men will often forgive and overlook other men's bad behavior. So all of these men writing and directing horror movies aren't going to point out that it's their own demographic that's the problem. So let's look at other ways men wrote slashers. A common motive for the slasher killer is revenge. And with this, we kind of get into the myth of the perfect victim, cycle of violence, hurt people bullshit. And it's perpetuating this myth that victims are either scared little white girls shaking in fear or snap and go on an insane journey of rage-filled vengeance, which is just not true. It also mitigates the guilt of the party that committed the original sin. I'm going to use the example of urban legend. Spoilers for urban legend. A redhead pulled a prank that led to the death of a man and ruined that man's friends, families, and more specifically, his fiance's lives. Years later, people are starting to get killed around the redhead. Turns out, fiance is out for revenge. Well, now fiance has arguably done worse acts than redhead. So she's no longer the victim. Redhead is. Redhead has effectively, in this role reversal, transitioning from bad guy to victim, been forgiven their bad deed. And the fiance, who was the original victim, is now the one who is demonized. And having lived for 3 decades, I can say one thing for sure. People have a real hard time holding two things to be true at once. Someone can simultaneously be the victim and the victimizer, even if that person is a woman. Shock. And that doesn't make their actions okay, nor does it mean they deserve to be hurt in the first place. I'm going to say something that will really blow some minds. A lot of women who are abused yell at their abuser, throw things back, hit back. That doesn't mean they deserve to be abused, were in any way, shape, or form asking for it, or were even abusing their abuser back. It's called defending yourself. Most victims of abuse do defend themselves. Okay. Most victims of abuse actually aren't timid little 100-pound white women shaking in a corner, totally subservient. But that's often how they look in movies and TV, isn't it? And that depiction creates real-world harm for real victims who don't look like that. And again, that doesn't even get into like how race plays a role in this. We're here to talk about slashers, though. It can be nice to watch someone get revenge on a cast who deserves to get got by the logic of the film. For me, that's often way more fun than watching innocent babysitters or campers getting knocked off one by one because Mr. Killer never got laid and that gives them homicidal rage. Just remember that most people who are victims of crimes or violence or abuse do not go on to hurt others, although watching it in movies can be kind of cathartic. Hashtag Angela was right. Also, don't prank people. Moving on, another motive is the Oedipal complex or sexual dysfunction seems to play into momism or your standard. It's the mom's fault that a grown man is actively choosing to murder people. I really, really hate this. And I already went into it. It's just annoying. It's, less. Yeah, I'm not going to get into it anymore. I'm just going to move on. Yeah, we'll just move on. Female killers. I'll just quickly note that female killers are way overrepresented in slasher films. Also, women poison. We don't slash. See Morgiana from 1972. There is a way to have a female killer that is empowering, like be female, do crime. It's rarely ever done that way, though. It's usually portrayed as like ultra jealous, mentally unstable, vapid harpies. Or mom who's trying to like get revenge for her son. Much like Friday the 13th. We need more Mary Lou Maloney's and Angela Baker's, is all I'm saying. Pamela Voorhees is due, I guess. Give me a killer mama bear. Realistic? Question mark. So I have Enter Slumber Party Massacre from 1983, a rare slasher film directed by a woman, though it was produced by Roger Corman, so still a victim of the male gaze, guys. The Slumber Party Massacre franchise is one of the only franchises I can think of 4 in total where it is completely directed by all women, only women. So the other ones being Fear Street, Bridget Jones, and The Matrix. I can't think of any more. If you could think of a franchise where every installment of that franchise was directed by women, please let me know. So Russ Thorne, or spoilers for Slumber Party Massacre, Russ Thorne's the killer. He's a man escaped. I don't know if he escaped from an institution or prison. I got a little confused. I just know he escaped from somewhere. And he hunts teen girls and then kills them at a slumber party. pretty standard fare. But specifically, he definitely is a sexual pervert. To quote, "You're pretty. All of you are very pretty. I love you. It takes a lot of love for a person to do this. You know you want it. You'll like it. Yes. I regret everything." He's a gross man who does talk, and he doesn't have any excuses or reasons. He's just a depraved killer. There's another proto-slasher steeped in realism called Night of the Hunter from 1955. I think it's 55. I hope it's not 57. God, don't let it be 53. So this spoilers for Night of the Hunter. There's this preacher who happens to, I'm way oversimplifying a great movie. Please watch this movie. There's this preacher who happens to be a serial killer. He ends up learning about this widow whose husband had hidden money. So he ends up marrying the widow and trying to get the money where his children know where the money is. So he kills his wife and goes after her children to get the money. Again, way oversimplifying. And it's a man at home killing his family for financial gain. There's literally nothing more realistic than that. You could see a direct through line from Night of the Hunter to The Stepfather in 1987. Also, great movie. Terry O'Quinn was mad good in The Stepfather. Oh my gosh. Then we have the mad masked mute killer. It's your pretty standard Halloween thing. So having the killer wear a mask and stalk around silently makes sense on a technical level. The writer doesn't have to write lines for them, and the filmmakers can just hire a stunt guy to play the slasher, which is cheaper. For reference, see Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, Freddy's Revenge. And hey, the killer not having a motive is pretty terrifying. Have you seen The Strangers? I don't know if I have a conclusion here. This is just my opinion, but by not giving these killers a voice, they lack autonomy and they're stripped of reason and humanity for the audience. And I think that unintentionally, this gives an out for the writer to not have to indict masculinity. The killer isn't a man. It's, as Dr. Loomis would say, a madman, psycho, evil, the boogeyman, death. When in reality, they're just men doing bad things because they want to. All right. Then we have the rule killer, which gets into Hicksploitation. And is that H-I-C-K or H-I-X? I don't know. You tell me. I want to quote Heidi Honeycutt explaining the film The Hitcher in her book, I Spit on Your Grave, the history of, I keep doing it. I Spit on Your Celluloid, the history of women directing horror movies from 2024. Sorry, you can hear my mouse. Okay, so quote, Myers, the killer, not to be confused with Michael Myers, this is the killer from the Hitcher, is a construct of modern corruption, disappointment, and technology. A killer that has adapted to the new social expectations of people, calmly settling down into the suburban sprawl connected by brand new, expensive freeways that facilitate housing developments and long work commutes, and leaving long, lonely stretches of uninhabited country marred only by telephone poles, concrete, and cars, while in earlier noir films, the city itself is a haven for corrupt cops, crooked politicians, and hard-boiled femme fatales that smother disappointment. Oh my God, I'm sorry to hear my mouse. Cynical war veterans in The Hitcher. The city is a comfortable nest where job, family, and home are protected from the shocking and harsh wilderness of the outside world. Bowen and Collins, the victims, are conformists, 1950s Cold War culture husbands looking for excitement and escape. Instead of reveling in gritty adventure, they find that they've gone soft, as Myra says. She continues on pulling, I guess, from this person, Rabanovitz. So still quoting Heidi Honeycutt, Rabanovitz suggests that the hitchhiker studies masculinity and power in the modern world. I agree, but posit, however, that The Hitcher is a precursor to many of the violent horror and thriller films of the late 20th century and early 21st centuries, in which everyday modern citizens become victims of dangerous backwards others that still live outside the known safe and comforting space. And then I want to quote her one more time. I know, so much quoting of Heidi Honeycutt and her book, I Spit on Your Celluloid, The History of Women Directing Horror. Quote, the seeds The seeds planted by, and then I forgot how to read. The seeds planted by the Hitcher would bloom into anti-rule culture sentiment later seen in 1970s horror films such as The Hills Have Eyes, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, classier mainstream pictures such as Straw Dogs and Deliverance, reinforced the continued perception that civilization equals good and countryside wilderness small town equals bad. And then I went on to kind of pull a quote from Robin Wood, who is a very famous film critic. I got a book, Robin Wood on the Horror Film, which is a collection of his essay. I pulled this quote from his essay on Race with the Devil. It seems valid, for instance, to read Monstrous Family of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre ex-slaughterhouse workers as representing an exploited, degraded proletariat. Okay. So here we get into my takeaways after all of these very long quotes. Okay. There is a level of classism in the rural killer versus the urban victim slasher films. Yes, they are on a technical level. They do help with isolating the victims from resources and help. Again, isolation is key to horror. But the cliche of these backwards, rural, often inbred or deformed killers is kind of odd. Like, does it play into the propaganda of American culture or of the American dream? You know, safe white suburbia with heteronormative mommy and daddy doing their jobs with 2.5 kids is safe. People on the outskirts of major cities living in poverty are dangerous. But like, we're all Americans. Why are rural Americans demonized? I actually don't get it. I was not alive in the 70s. I missed out. Civilization is safe. Isolation is backwards and dangerous. Like, have you lived in a big city? And again, have you lived in a small town? I've done both. And they have their pros and cons. Ultimately, I do think that it is feelings of superiority from a place of intellectual and financial privilege. Uneducated Hicks, Southerners, rednecks are dangerous. It's classist. A wise harbinger of doom said in Children of the Corn, well, folks in Gatling got religion. They don't like outsiders. That be true. That be true. That's exactly how I would describe the small town I went to high school in exactly as Gatlin. I even knew someone named Isaac. Oh, talk about a nightmare. I think it's funny though that like Toby Hooper, the director of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is from Texas. No one loves Texas as much as someone from Texas. Equally, no one hates Texas as much as someone from Texas. And the same can be said for anywhere in the Deep South, Midwest, or the Appalachian Mountains, and etc. Comparatively to a lot of big cities, like most people I know from LA love LA. Most people I know not from LA hate LA. Very strange. Like I kind of, to me, it came down to this. It's easy to make fun of those backwards, gross, uneducated Hicks and believe we are so much better than our own countrymen. But having lived all over the US my entire 3-decade plus life, yeah, it's just most America. Like, most of us aren't better. We're just not cannibals. Idiocracy is a documentary, you say. Children of the Corn is a documentary, I say. But I'm from LA, so we'll move on. I need to look further into that. Okay, so we're moving on to the other half of the equation. Yes, that's right. The main character herself. The protagonist, the final girl. I already have a whole video on the final girl. So I'm going to talk about it differently than I talked about in that video. So that video is separate. However, I do think it's important to define the final girl. And I'm going to define it by the woman who coined the term herself, Carol J. Clover. A lot of times it's incorrectly credited to her 1992 book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Gender in the Modern Horror Film. However, she does describe the final girl in her 1987 article, Her Body, Himself, Gender in the Slasher Film. So I'm taking this quote from the 87 article, Her Body, Himself, Gender in the Slasher Film by Carol J. Clover. The one character of stature who does live to tell the tale is, of course, the female. The final girl is introduced at the beginning of and is the only character to be developed in any psychological detail. We understand immediately from the attention paid to it that hers is the main storyline. She's intelligent, watchful, level-headed, the first character to sense something amiss, and the only character to deduce from the accumulating evidence the patterns and extent of the threat. The only one, in other words, whose perspective approaches our own privileged understanding of the situation. We register her horror as she stumbles on the corpses of her friends. Her paralysis in the face of death duplicates those moments of the universal nightmare experience on which horror frankly trades. When she downs the killer, we are triumphant. She is, by any measure, the slasher film's hero. So much like trying to break down the slasher killer, I tried to break down the types of final girls. I really did, but they're all kind of the same. So final girls are basically depressed, stressed, anxiety spiral, hyper alert good girls who maybe should smoke a little something and relax. Historically, final girls aren't cool or fun or charismatic. Their job is to be cowering, terrified white girls who are chased through the third act, drop whatever weapon they have picked up after one single swing, and somehow make it to the end of the movie traumatized but alive. As the 1980s wore on, we did start getting final girls with more personality, but it took a while. It's not until 1984 that the depiction shifts. Even then, the most charming final girl still fits the description above. She might just get a few one-liners and keep the weapon a little longer. Yikes. So to talk a little about representation, females are the stars, the main characters, the protagonists of the slasher film, typically. Not only that, but they get to be kind of an action hero starting in about 84, which is unique today, let alone in the late 70s to 80s. But it's in defending themselves against violence where ultimately, even though they survive, they are still a victim. And like I said, they don't really become the badass action hero final girl genre until 1984. There are some early outliers like Alien and Poltergeist, but they're few and far between, and those aren't slashers. They're just, action horror movie and ghost horror movie. The argument over whether slashers are anti-women in their depictions of violence against women or feminist in giving a woman a lead role where they can be the hero of the film is a long thought one, and I'm not here to provide a definitive answer. Also, it's a case-by-case basis, or should I say movie by movie, and some are better than others. In my opinion, I do think it's both. I know two opposing things can be true at once, so complex. Is it healthy to have this cliche depiction of a woman getting getting killed? Whoa, wow. Is it healthy to have this cliched depiction of a woman getting killed half nude after sex? No, that's purity culture. Stop it. But is giving the woman a chance to lead a movie good? Yes. Does the good outweigh the bad? I don't know. All I can say is that as a person with a vagina, I like horror. While slashers are far from my favorite subgenre of horror, I do enjoy many of them, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Just be aware of the issues, and it's okay to like imperfect things. So go a little bit into content analysis, such as On the Perils of Living Dangerously in the slasher horror film by Andrew Walsh. It's a study on slasher films. I go way more into this on my sex equals death trope essay. So I look at a number of quantitative studies on the slasher film. That's just one of them. And so I'm just going to sum up what I've learned from that. Again, if you want more detail into that, I explore much further in that essay, but just here's the conclusion. That though a lot of studies showed, I just used this one example on the Perils of Living Dangerously in the slasher film by Andrew Walsh. Men are killed more in the slasher film. This is due to a few reasons. Women survive more, and men are hired more to be in roles. So let's say you're making a slasher film. You want to hire 5 people. You're going to hire 3 men and 2 women. Well, one of the women survives. So you can have 3 male victims, 1 female victim, and 1 female survivors. So yeah, you're going to have a higher male body count because you hired more guys to be in your movie, which comes into biases in casting practices. Thank you for your time. Women are depicted in longer death scenes and in peril and more exposed in those death scenes. Horror shows nude women in danger, and it shows them for a longer duration than men, which is just simply unhealthy. Okay. And it kind of goes into like the virgin whore dichotomy. Again, I went much further into this. I don't want to get too bogged down on that. But basically, like, the good girl lives is problematic. Firstly, because most of these are written and directed by men. I think that plays a heavy part in it. And secondly, because sex sells, women are required to be nude more in horror films, and going back into that learned bias thing, the way that victims are often portrayed is in a hypersexual way, and the survivor is portrayed as like a shy, introverted good girl. Again, playing into the virgin whore dichotomy. Good girls live, bad girls die, sex is bad, blah, blah, blah. It goes back to purity culture, which is stop. Let the good final girl have sex. She earned it. Okay, then we have the male final girl. I know, just go with me here. In the language of cinema, it's well established that the surviving victim of the slasher film is a woman. That doesn't mean all final girls are, well, girls. There are some final boys given. Most final boys are very much that, boys. Male survivors do tend to be younger, generally prepubescent. See Friday the 13th, 4 and 5, People Under the Stairs, Child's Play, so on. But there are some teen and adult final boys. But when put in the traditional female role, by definition, their character is emasculated, and I find something interesting about that. So I looked at a few for comparisons. So there's a reason that A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2, Freddy's Revenge, is considered the gayest slasher. There's a lot of reasons, but this is one of them. And there's also an argument the same could be said for Fright Night, but that's not a slasher, so we'll stick to Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy's Revenge. I think that's because they play it like any other slasher without adjusting the script to fit a male lead. So comparatively, Evil Dead 2, Bruce Campbell isn't playing the final girl, even though he very much is a final girl. He's playing a John Wayne-esque action hero in the position of a final girl. And having the lead be a man can make for a funny comparison. For instance, in Creep in 2014, I guess slight spoilers, I frequently found myself saying, yeah, this character needed to be a man because a woman would never do this. This guy wrote an ad, goes out to meet a man, and continues to be around this man, even though he's giving every red flag. And then when he gets home, this guy's kind of stalking him. And he at one point goes outside to investigate. Like, a woman would never, not without a weapon anyway, never. And I felt the same way with Barbarian. Even though that's a female lead, it's definitely, I found myself saying, oh, a man made this. Because, well, we have a woman going into a house with a man alone, with a man she doesn't know, who's like 6'4". I don't know how tall Bill Skarsgård, the clown Skarsgård is. A woman would never do that. And she's a woman of color. No, not happening. Ridiculous. So by the opening of the movie, I'm checked out. I'm like, this girl should be dead. What's happening? I don't even care about this. She's making dumb choices. It's rare that men are depicted as weak or cowering in fear in films. Gee, I wonder why. Even though in the same position as Laurie Strode, a guy would be just as afraid. All right. I don't really know if I have a further point on that. So my last one here is the black guy dies first trope. Yeah, it's not always about men versus women. There are other types of representation. I mean, not a lot in the 80s, but it's a non-zero number. Much like Randy told us the rules and Sydney decided to have internalized, I'm better than other girls in Scream. Scream 2 gave us Maureen Evans pointing out cinematic crime that movies continue to go on to commit. And FYI, just because you acknowledge the problem before engaging in it doesn't make you better. It still makes you part of the problem. Scream 2. All right, so we have Phil and Maureen talking. Phil, now why would you want to pay $7.50 to see some Sandra Bullock unless she's naked? Maureen, oh, but you will sit through some movie called Stab? Phil, it's an adrenaline rush, Maureen. That's what it is. Maureen, no, I'll tell you what it is. It's some dumbass white movie about some dumbass white girls getting their white asses cut the fuck up. Phil, is that what it is? Maureen, no. I'm just saying that the horror genre is historical for excluding the African American element. Now, I'm not black, but I can read. And so I read a book, and I totally recommend it. The Black Guy Dies First, Black Horror Cinema from Fodder to Oscar by Dr. Robin R. Means Coleman from 2023. And I'll quote him. I have 3 quotes pulled, and I do absolutely recommend the book. It is quite good. Okay. Quote 1 by Dr. Robin R. Means Coleman. Okay, hang on. The Black Guy dies first. Okay, so here's the quote. But does he really? The answer, in fact, is a resounding no. He might die second or third in more nihilistic films, 17th, but odds are pretty good that he will indeed die. How good? Well, in an informal and soul-crushing survey of almost 1,000 horror movies containing more than 1,500 appearances by Black characters, we found their mortality rate to be around 45%. Given this figure includes minor non-speaking and sometimes nameless roles that may not even warrant a death. The fact that they're nearly 1 out of every 2 dies sounds like a genocidist's wet dream. The second quote by Dr. Robin R. Means Coleman. Of course, it is a new age of edgy horror. Black characters aren't the only ones dying. But since Black people were still allowed to play only ancillary, can't pronounce that word, roles, they suddenly found themselves in the cinematic crosshairs, and more ancillary the role, the greater the chance they would die before the characters developed and audiences can come to sympathize with them. And the last one I'd like to quote from Dr. Robin R. Means Coleman from The Black Guy Dies First, Black Horror Cinema from Fodder to Oscar. It doesn't have to be with any malintent that Hollywood movers and shakers craft Black characters so poorly. But with little knowledge or consideration of the Black experience, they naturally treat them with a sense of otherness. Black people become something audiences can't relate to and whose exoticism is at best mysterious and at worst dangerous. Ignorance, after all, breeds lazy writing. Worse, it breeds fear. That quote above can honestly be swapped out for the female experience, the queer experience, certainly for slashers, the trans experience. Basically when, again, overwhelmingly you just have white men behind the scenes, you get a certain type of story and way of telling it and repeat it over and over. Anyway, it seems to me that slashers focus on hetero white audiences like most cinema throughout the history, and certainly throughout the 80s. I can think of slashers that have a Black character survive, but it's a small, finite amount. And I can think of less where a Black woman survives. Slashers really don't get into intersectional issues as much as you think. Shout out to Wes Craven, Don Mancini, and Kevin Williamson for pushing boundaries. But it's not until Jordan Peele's prestige film that studios started to really give Black horror a serious chance. The same could be said for Kevin Williamson for queer horror. And as much as Blaxploitation began to open doors in the 70s, it kind of died out in the 80s. The 80s was, according to Dr. Robin R. Means Coleman, kind of a dry spell for Black people in horror films. So I don't know for sure, but part of me thinks that this goes back to the final girl. She's the star. She's a representation of the good victim. So she's white. For decades, we've since had some slashers with women of color leading, and I mean leading, not just surviving, leading. I Still Know What You Did Last Summer, Scream 5 or 6, they're surviving, but they're not leading. For actual, surviving woman of color final girl, we have Us, The Blackening, Barbarian, Demon Knight. I'm sure there are others, but those are the ones that I can think of, and that's not many, which is tragic. Slashers still have a long way to go in terms of representation. I didn't really even get into queer slashers like Nightmare on Elm Street 2, They, Them, High Tension, Sleepaway Camp, Hellraiser. And I'm not going to because that's a whole other thing. So I'll leave it at a yikes. Long story short, we as a society still have a long way to go with how Black characters are portrayed on screen in every genre. But that only happens if there is more behind the scene representation. And that goes for all forms of representation in every aspect of television and cinema and life. We need to do better. All right. And the last part I want to talk about to wrap up is interpretation. And I just have a few like loose ends I want to like note real quick. So interpretation, arguing against the status quo of accepted interpretation, which is at its most basic level what I just have been doing, and is a base. Well, okay, agreed upon interpretation is just opinion, and it's a totally okay if you disagree with it or agree with it. A lot of agreed upon film interpretation is based in archaic agreed upon academia, which took root in the once accepted at the time Freudian literature, also Lacan and Althusser. And let's be clear, that was all just opinion, very soft science. I can't stress that enough. Freud is soft science at best and mostly unused now because we've learned a lot more since then. And yeah. So a few last threads I want to get into, like phallic and yonic imagery. Yes, I learned the word yonic because I watched Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon. I can't lie like this. I think it's dumb and people are looking way too deep. Unless it's like Slumber Party Massacre where the weapon is obviously supposed to be a phallic metaphor, then a knife is just a knife, and the female survivor picking it up is not emasculating the male killer, and the knife is not a representation of the male killer's penis. Like, calm down. What are you doing? While we're at this topic of knives not being phallic, America, I know we're puritanical, but this is ridiculous. A knife being used to stab a woman is not and should not be equated with a penis penetrating a vagina or any other orifice. That is so dangerous for everyone. It equates all penetrative sex as violent. Stop. Guys, if you penetrate someone willingly, you're not basically stabbing them at all. And if the party being penetrated, or if you're the party being penetrated, it shouldn't feel like you're being stabbed at all. Let's have a healthier relationship to sex, shall we? It's supposed to feel good. Damn. Sex and drugs are capital offenses. Okay, Reagan, we can stop. Modern slashers, because there have been so many, tend to have a hat in a hat mentality now. Like, it's a slasher and Freaky Friday and time travel and Groundhog's Day and with a sloth and with a dancing robot and from the killer's point of view. They're a lot more meta and have a lot more representation. They're usually more campy and have a post-90s, meta view, thanks to Kevin Williamson and Don Mancini. I'm on like page 45 and I have no idea how to end this and what the point is. I don't know if I have a point. It took a lot to be able to make slasher films, from censorship reducing to practical effects getting easier, and a lot of key people made specific films that changed the landscape of the genre. The slasher genre developed slowly over decades and exploded in the late 70s and then started to kind of run on fumes by the 90s. Female representation is both good and bad in this subgenre. Queer representation and people of color generally are not depicted well. I have a whole hour and 40-minute video on the trans representation in the slasher. Purity culture and conservative slants of slashers could still be improved. Yeah, but it certainly got a lot better. I don't know. I think that's it. Like, they had a slow start. They're slowly dying out, kind of, unless Terrifier can save it. Maybe Mithrigan. Slashers are a beloved genre for whatever reason. For loving or hating them as a whole, your reason for that is valid. Maybe you've been introspective and understand why you like them. Maybe you haven't. Maybe your love aligns with the academic assertion that they are a cathartic way to experience fear. Maybe you're like me and you think that's stupid, and I like them because I love special effects. And a lot of these movies are made in an era where cocaine was the biggest part of the budget. Okay, I'm joking, but am I? And so the plots are wild. Like, unlike most movies, I couldn't possibly guess what's going to happen. It's actually a surprise. They're usually more unique than other genres. You mean to tell me this isn't a werewolf movie? It was a slasher the whole time? What? The killer was Hitler? Like actual Hitler? What the fuck? Wait, she has a twin? Wait, she doesn't have a twin? It was the mother? It was the children? Is he the good guy or the bad guy? Ugh, this guy sucks. Kill him. They're fun. Violent, but fun. I guess what it comes down to is like what you like. Fuck the critics. Engage with material so you know how these films have evolved, know their pitfalls, and where they, as a genre, have improved. Because these movies are influenced by real life. They took nearly 40 years to get a Black final girl. These movies couldn't be overtly queer until the late 90s. We still have the virgin horde economy. The last guy in a dress killing people reveal was only 11 years ago. So on. And yeah, these movies could really have better depictions of the female experience and of how they portray people with mental illness, especially on screen. And they could have a lot better stuff going on behind the screens in terms of representation. And with all that said, I think I'm out. This is over 2 hours. My throat hurts. I'm going to go rewatch Slaughterhouse and root for the sloth. So, yeah, have a great day. Thank you for listening or watching. And with that, I got some oozing to do. Stay with the rainbows.